Welcome to McGuire on Wrestling.
What do you guys want to talk about?
Let's give the people what they want. Professional wrestling.
With Mike McGuire.
The happiest Canadian camper in the world. Tell me when I'm telling lies. Give me a hell yeah.
Hello, thanks for being here. Thanks for downloading the show. Thanks for being a part of McGuire on Wrestling and Team MOW. I really like the team aspect of this. A big shout out to the alternate commentary table. You get them in your podcast feed every Saturday before this show launches on a Sunday. And they had another rocket buster. Just a good time. Like, I love listening to those guys because they take all the serious talk about wrestling and make it ridiculous and make it fun. And if you haven't checked out that show yet, you should. So they're a part of the team. There are more people joining the team. There are people on the team that you don't hear from at all. They're kind of behind the scenes in this whole thing. But nevertheless, we're all happy that you're here. I'm happy to talk to you about pro wrestling, always for free, always about pro wrestling. That's what the show is about. Of course, if you're getting this in your podcatcher already, you've probably figured out you can subscribe every single week. We do have a store. It's a little merch store. It's a humble beginnings. But if you'd like to support the show with a couple shekels our way, it's appreciated. I tell you, the Greek guys are taking off with this GWO stuff they're doing. They're absolutely loving it, too. You can go to McGuireShow.com. There is a full website in the works, by the way, but for now, it just takes you to the shop. It ships to you directly, and it's awesome. Also, I invite you to the Team MOW Facebook group if you haven't been there yet. Lots of great folks, lots of familiar faces, lots of new faces. And everybody's talking about wrestling, sharing their stories, sharing things they hear and see. And I love that, too, because I like to know who we're talking to out here. So enjoy you being a part of this community. I dare say family. Dare say. If you have any comments, anything you'd like to see in the shop, anything you'd like to have on the show, I always love hearing from you directly. You can reach me on social media at McGuire Show, or you can email me, McGuireShow@yahoo.com. Coming up this week, WWE has culled its roster considerably. So, who could break through in this new landscape, and which released stars are the ones to get for other companies? New Japan's new English commentator has been revealed. The King is out and about. We get an update on the condition of one of AEW's top stars. Dave Meltzer is here from the Wrestling Observer to fill us in on these stories and more. Plus, this week, Al Castle, senior writer for Pro Wrestling Illustrated, is joining me. It's becoming our annual tradition where we're going to dive into this year's PWI 500 that came out a couple weeks ago. He'll answer some of the rights, take on some of the wrongs, but it's always a fun time talking to Al, who's a big-time wrestling fan, big-time writer, and just a great conversation. So, without further ado, let's get to it after we get through some of the top stories from this week.
You want to hear the breaking news?
Well, as of recording, there's been no further WWE talent cuts, but the latest was a bit of a surprise in Matt Riddle. The multiple-time champion in WWE posted he was no longer with the company on Friday. Now, coming up with Dave Meltzer, we're going to go through some of the names that were on the chopping block, and while many of the names were from the main roster, several NXT names were also released, and they fall in line with something that WWE has talked about before in a cyclical outline of talent hires and releases. You might remember it was Shawn Michaels and Triple H talking about how they will have a certain period to bring wrestlers in through tryouts, see how they do, and if they do well, they move forward. If they don't, they cut losses. So it seems as though that practice is in full swing. Again, we'll have to see what happens in the next coming week if there's more releases. Well, the other big news coming from WWE is, could Monday Night Raw be moving from Mondays? As you may have heard, effective October of next year, SmackDown is moving from Fox back to the USA Network in the United States. Whether or not the show goes back to Thursdays or stays on Fridays is unknown. But the more interesting story out of this is that Monday Night Raw is now apparently up for grabs. Raw currently airs along with NXT on USA, but having all three shows on the same network doesn't seem to be in the future for WWE. So streaming services, other cable, and even major networks are in the running, but there's even talk that Raw could be moving days with the right buyer. All this is speculation, but Mondays without wrestling? Hard pass. Hard pass. Impact Wrestling's PCO has reportedly given notice to Impact Wrestling that he will not be renewing his contract. Pat LaPrade broke that news earlier today. PCO's contract is set to expire next month. PCO first went to Impact Wrestling when the sale of Ring of Honor happened and went to Tony Khan. There has been no official word as to what, if any, PCO's next move will be. Friend of the show, friend of mine, friendly guy, wishing nothing but the best. New Japan Pro Wrestling has a new English commentator on deck. Walker Stewart has been reported as the new voice, replacing Kevin Kelly. Now, Walker's been making a name for himself commentating and producing events for some time now. You've likely heard Walker on matches for New South Pro Wrestling or Future Stars of Wrestling, on a bigger scale with GCW and Mission Pro, just to name a few. This guy travels everywhere and kind of lives the dream that I've got, too, of just going around and doing wrestling shows. I love it. John Pollock from Post Wrestling announced the news on Twitter. Kevin Kelly, who of course is serving as New Japan's current English commentator, announced a while ago he was going to step down, want to spend more time at home. Kelly still has a few more appearances for New Japan coming up before Walker Stewart will take over. And good to see Jerry the King Lawler out and about, making an appearance at a Comic-Con in Memphis, his hometown, of course. Lawler had a massive stroke back in February of this year and hadn't been seen or heard from other than a brief video appearance for WWE and also in a live appearance during a commercial break on an episode of Monday Night Raw. But Lawler has been at the con this past weekend signing autographs and is said to be looking good.
You got to stream the alternate commentary table. Every single Saturday, it's brought to you on the McGuire on Wrestling feed. I'm one half of your host, Dimitri Karolis, and I'm here with my partner, Mitch Hondras. Mitch, what is the alternate commentary table?
It's simple. It's the perspective of wrestling from the other side of the railing, the real fans.
That's right, the perspective that you need. You might have a little bit of fun, too. The alternate commentary table. Subscribe free now to the McGuire on Wrestling podcast feed wherever you get your podcast. Cha-cha!
It's time for the Wrestling Observer Insider with Dave Meltzer, McGuire on Wrestling.
Well, Dave, I did have a topic I wanted to start off this week with, and we were going to talk a little bit about AEW and making money, but then, lo and behold, we also had the conversation last week after WWE had a massive layoff of office employees. Would it or wouldn't it hurt talent? At first, we were thinking that they might go off like UFC and the talent might be left alone, but we found out that was quite a different story.
Yeah. Thing is there's a real, I would say, credibility issue now that they have to deal with, which is the same thing UFC had to deal with after the sale, which is that they say one thing and they do something else. Because, I mean, they were talking about like no production and no talent changes. And then literally the week after the thing goes down, there's all kinds of talent releases. So, and then also the SmackDown deal, you know, they had told Wall Street expect 50% increase or more, and they got a 40% increase, which is good, but it's not what the stock price was built on 50%. So the stock tumbled, even with the cuts. You know, the cuts were probably there to help the stock price. That didn't happen because of the feeling that they were told 50 to 70% increase, and they got a 40% increase. So that was another thing. So it was a big week for WWE news for sure.
Do you think they had the cuts already in mind, knowing that they were going to take a hit on the Fox deal, or?
Oh, I think the Fox deal and the cuts are two different things. Okay. I don't think one had anything to do with the other. But as far as the cuts go, my impression that I was given from asking is that most of the cuts had been decided, but there were some on the bubble, Mustafa Ali being the obvious one, because, you know, he was still being pushed in an angle. When I look at the cuts, in most cases, I mean, look, there's people who they just made the decision they're not going to make it. And then you've got main roster guys that were in developmental, and they don't want, you know, people with that pay grade in developmental. And Dolph Ziggler wasn't even doing anything, and he was a very highly paid guy. So, I mean, it made sense. It made sense from that standpoint. I mean, there's obviously, you know, you bring up, what about Apollo Crews? What about Baron Corbin? You know, I mean, those are the two most obvious ones because they're in developmental. I think that in the case of Corbin, what may save him is they may think that he's a guy we can always plug back in and have as a pretty solid heel on the main roster.
Right.
So, I mean, maybe, you know, he may get cut next week, but I'm just thinking that's how I would kind of look at Corbin, as someone that you don't want to throw away. You know, whereas with Ziggler, I think that they just decided he's 43 years old, he's a big money guy, and we're just not using him. And then as far as Crews, you know, I worry about Crews because of all the things. I mean, he's in the same category as Ali, and even less because he doesn't even have a program in NXT. And Aziz is another one because Aziz was Dana Brooke was a main roster contract. A lot of them were main roster contracts as far as the name people that were let go that they weren't doing anything with.
Yeah, and a lot of those people had deals for a while, and yeah, nothing had been happening with them. I was a little surprised to see some of the names go. Do you think that Vince being more in control on the WWE side of things as an overseer now has more to do with who's coming and going?
Yes, definitely.
Because a lot of these names we saw were names that Triple H especially had kind of got behind or had given different opportunities to, or in some cases hadn't. There were some.
He didn't give anything to Ziggler.
Well, that's what I mean. There's some that actually fell off quite a bit. Rick Boogs just made a statement this morning that came out saying that backstage politicking was involved, perhaps, in why he was on that release list.
Well, I mean, him and Elias both were guys. I mean, you could say, look, they were going to start a program with them. I mean, you saw the start, then they just dropped it. Right. So it was like whoever made the call to drop it. I mean, Rick Boogs was an interesting guy because he was getting pretty over, and then they separated him from Nakamura, and then he just floundered. It reminded me of, if you remember, Alberto Del Rio and Ricardo Rodriguez were a very hot act. And then they decide to separate them, and I go, like, separating them is going to hurt both of them, and there's no plus to it. And Rodriguez has nothing if they separate him. They try to make him this baby face that was just going to go nowhere, which it did, and that essentially ended his career. And he had a lot of problems over that. And I think that Boogs was very similar in the sense that he is in a hot act. They separated them for no reason. I mean, he got hurt, but they could have brought it back. He was in a pretty good position last year, a year ago at WrestleMania. And now here he is. He's the injury really took him out of the game. And then, they were going to do him with the program with Elias. Then they both ended up being dropped.
And I guess that's just one case of a talent that had what seemed to be a pretty clear future ahead for them here. Another one that a lot of people are surprised about, I was actually pretty surprised on this one too, is Riddick Moss. He's
a talented guy.
Yeah, and he had gotten over the whole Madcap Moss thing, which was no help to anybody, really. But yeah, this guy to me just kind of screamed everything that was what WWE would build a wrestler on. I mean, great build, great look, great personality, lousy gimmick, but great personality. You know what I mean? You could see the talent beyond the gimmick. So
the gimmick was no good, but they got rid of the gimmick, and when he turned babyface, he was starting to get over, with Corbin and everything, and then they just dropped using him, and I think that's what it was. But yeah, he's a guy. I always thought he had potential. Like you said, really good athlete, one of the best athletes in the entire company, and an intense worker. He's never really had the chance to show it. But he's got that speed coming off the ropes that few guys have. He's got the power, from the football linebacker thing. And, in a sense, I'm not surprised because they weren't doing anything with him. And so all the guys they weren't doing anything with. But I did think he had potential that was untapped. But you just don't know where's the mentality. It's like some of these guys I think could do something. But you just don't know because so many guys, when they're let go, they just kind of, flounder and don't do anything. I just remember like Matt Cardona, just as an example, he got let go and he went and wrestles all over the world and he's having even more fun. And those are the guys that, to me, you think about coming back because they're real wrestlers. Some of these other guys, it's like they were in wrestling to make WWE money. And some of those guys get brought back, but when they do nothing, on the independent scene, they don't even try. It's almost like, they're not into the wrestling aspect of it. They're into being WWE stars. And the guys who usually make it on the second try, perfect example is McIntyre. McIntyre went all over the world and built his name and got better. If you're sitting at home, you're not getting better. I've seen so many of these guys get cut and they go, oh, we'll be back. Then they don't even do any indies. It's like, you're not going to get better if you don't do indies.
Right.
And so in every one of these cases, it's going to be very interesting to see. Everyone will try to get into AEW, but Tony should be very selective. He's got too many guys now, and overloaded with WWE cast-offs is not what you want to be, but a couple of the guys can help him. And Rick Moss may be one of them. When you do nothing after leaving, the reality is you're not improving. And in this business right now, unless you're, top of the line guy, you really need to keep improving because the standard keeps going up.
I guess just going through a few of the bigger names here, and the one I want to save for the end is Riddle here because there's obviously more stories behind that guy. But Mason Mansoor, obviously having a bit of a push there with the models gimmick, but then
that was a bad gimmick too, though.
The Alpha Academy thing took over.
Yeah.
And
I wasn't surprised with Mace. Although, again, being a big football player, usually helps you, but there's a lot of those guys in developmental now too. Mansoor surprised me a lot because, Saudi Arabian star,
right.
and they'd only have one, and Saudi Arabia is a big, big, big market for them. And he's not bad. I mean, for his level of experience, actually, he's quite good. Like he was a guy who came from the Indies. I could see him going back to Indies. I could see him continuing to improve. But, they weren't doing anything with Mason Mansour, and that gimmick was a one-note gimmick. And it was a death gimmick. But again, like their main roster contract guys pulling in, I don't think that they were pulling in giant money, but they were pulling in main roster money and they weren't being used. And that seemed to be the deal, is if you're pulling in main roster money and you're not on the main roster going on the road now, we're going to cut you because we're cutting expenses.
Is the stock price going to dictate whether or not there's more cuts? Is that basically what we're waiting for? Or okay.
No. I think that it was just one of those things where they haven't cut anyone in a long time. And, this was the impetus. And now we're going to cut the people that we're not using. And we're not going to. The thing is UFC does not worry about guys going to Bellator or PFL at all.
Right.
Of course, WWE completely worries about AEW because that's their nature. But the people who are in charge of Vince, they don't worry. They just see WWE and they don't worry about anyone else. They just see WWE as for profits. So a lot of the decisions that Vince may have made or Paul Levesque may have made to compete with AEW while losing money doing it, I could see these guys just going like, oh, we don't care. In every business that they're in their agenting business, there's other companies. In their, you know what I mean? In every business these guys are in, there's other companies. Whereas with wrestling, WWE always wanted to be the only big one. There's a million wrestling companies. They know it. I don't think that they care about it. I think that they're just out for the maximum profits of WWE. So that is a different mentality. I think that has a lot to do with this, because in the case of before, let's just say a year ago, they may look at this list and go, could this guy help AEW? And if the answer is yes, we'd rather ice him than cut him, know? Whereas now I don't think that was even a thought.
There's no saying that these people can't be brought back down the road in some cases, but there would have to
in some cases, but
there would be a pretty good reason why, right?
Yeah, I think in most cases they won't. There will always be exceptions. I mean, before a lot of guys got brought back because Triple H, they were Paul Levesque guys, and Vince was out of power, and he wanted to bring back the guys that he still wanted to keep that Vince got rid of. You're not going to have that dynamic now. I mean, Vince probably made the final calls on all of these guys. But Vince is not going to be, unless he disappears or something happens, Paul Levesque's not going to be bringing these guys back. Again, there could be something. Someone may have a great idea for somebody and bring them back. But with so many people in developmental, I think that, rather than, give Dolph Ziggler a big push, we'll give that push to Braun Breaker. You know what I mean? That type of a situation.
Just a couple last names here before we get into Riddle. Top Dollar. This guy has admitted in his own right that he's been outspoken at times. Do you think maybe it was something like that had him rocking the boat and they didn't want to risk that again, or is it just
it's not so much, it's not rocking the boat. It's, he made a lot of enemies and he wasn't a top guy. If you're CM Punk, you can get rid of, you can live with that for much, much longer. If you're a bottom guy and you're making a lot of enemies, in this business, you're not going to last because he wasn't necessary. He wasn't over. He's a big, fast guy. I thought he had something, but they decided not to go with him. And, the rest of that act, Deshante and B-Fab, I'd be worried if I was them too.
Did they miss the boat with Elias? This guy did a lot of things and made a lot of, they went to the point they had the album on iTunes go to number one. Like there was definitely a groundswell for this guy. I don't know. I always enjoyed him, but I just feel like they never really caught fire with him.
He had he's one of those things that he had a period where he did well, but his in-ring was not there. And then they decided when to drop the music gimmick. And I thought when they dropped the music gimmick, he was dead because now he has to get over on his wrestling and his wrestling isn't that good. And that's what happened. Without the music gimmick was a great gimmick for him. Mm-hmm. They should not have dropped it. But I think that they just felt they've gone as far as with it as they can. Now they got to get him. He's got to get over as a wrestler. And he didn't.
Okay. Shelton Benjamin, we've been down the road with Shelton before. I mean, he's a guy who's always...
It's an age thing. I mean, he's 48 years old, not being used. You know, he may find some work in Japan, or who knows? I mean, AEW could take him. I mean, but it's 48 years old when you're not like a megastar. You know, it's one thing if you're Edge when you're that age, or you'll be in demand. But Shelton, didn't have the career that Edge had.
And let's get to it now. I guess. I mean, Ziggler, we could talk to death here, and I think if anything, we save that to see what he does next. I'm very curious about. But Matt Riddle is obviously the big name that had been on TV a lot up to just a couple weeks ago. There was something strange that happened with him and allegedly some police at an airport or something.
Yeah, the JFK airport. He came back from India, and there was a disturbance. And with Riddle, there just been so many different things that had happened. Some that we don't even know about, some that I've heard that I'm trying to investigate if they even happened. I mean, because, when this stuff like this happens, you start hearing a lot of stories. But But the point of it all is that it wasn't any one thing like this thing, but that was the straw that broke the camel's back. And I think that they just felt they had already, I could see a year ago that they had just because there were people that were very supportive of him.
Yeah.
But And he had a good upward trajectory. The Randy Orton Riddle thing turned out way better than anyone expected. Certainly, the original idea was 3 weeks, and then Randy Orton turns on him, and then, it got hot. Then Orton got hurt, so that hurt a little bit. But there was a point where, and you could tell, like with the Gunther matches and everything, that they had decided that he's not worth the risk of pushing, and he clearly could see it and was unhappy. Then another thing happens, and another thing happens. And I think that at that point, it's just, they decided to cut him. It's an interesting one. Of all the ones, Tony Khan's going to say yes to a few and no to most. He's the most intriguing one because it's like, I know people who say like he shouldn't, and I know people say you got to try. He made a certain call with Jeff Hardy. I don't know that was the right call in hindsight. And that may factor into this one. If there was no Jeff Hardy, I think he would have given him a shot. And I think that he'll probably give him a shot, but then it's one of those things where you almost have to go in there with him and just go. But Riddle, it's if it was only WWE, it's one thing. But you got to remember, like Riddle with UFC and with Bellator, he had issues with management there too. So he's got the talent by far, but it's just a question of, can he get along with management and can he stay out of trouble? And WWE, for WWE to cut him, there must have been the belief that, we've given him so many chances and it didn't happen. And so then it's like, well, if it didn't work in WWE, can it work somewhere else? And sometimes it does, but a lot of times it doesn't. So it makes for a very interesting decision.
And you alluded to something there that I did want to bring up, and that was the Jeff Hardy factor. Tony did take a chance with Jeff. It's backfired more than once now. Yet Jeff is still on the roster and still performing at this time. Who knows if there will be a renewal or not in the future, but he's still got him there. Do you think that Tony wants to roll the dice twice on someone? And I'm not saying that Riddle has problems or doesn't have problems. He has said he's gone to rehab.
But he's got something. If he didn't, he'd be in WWE.
That's what I mean. There's something there.
If Riddle had no negative issues, he'd be up there in the WWE title picture. When he had that match with Roman Reigns, they did a phenomenal rating. So it's like, it was one of the first ones of this big run, where things started turning around, where I looked, oh my God, Matt Riddle and Roman, because Roman was not necessarily this giant mover either. And all of a sudden it's like, wow, they're movers together. And Roman, benefited from it. And Riddle really didn't, but that's because it isn't because they didn't see anything in him. It's because they didn't trust him.
They can't trust him outside. Yeah.
With the push, they didn't want to make him a top guy, because if you're a top guy and you screw up, it's like negative. If you're like a middle guy, it's not as bad. So they very much tempered him. Yeah,
But I guess the question is, do you think Tony is willing to take the risk?
I don't know. Didn't have Jeff Hardy. I think that he would have. Even with Jeff Hardy, it's almost like the guy's so talented, you almost want to give him a shot, but then you don't want to make that mistake, because I think he gets a shot. I think it's got to be a zero tolerance position, though.
Well, I guess we'll see what happens there in the future. Okay, well, I think that's good for the WWE firings for now, and we'll see. Do you think there's any more to come in the future here in the next little while, or do you think we're done for this?
Yeah. I think so. I think we'll be seeing more regularly. They'll say no, but if it happened once, it was the same thing with Endeavor with UFC. It's like no more employees cut, then more employees get cut. I think that the new rule of thumb is probably going to be, if you're making a lot of money and you're not being used, then you're going to be on the chopping block. Whereas before, the mentality was, if we think, even if we're not going to use you, if we think that you can help the opposition, we're going to keep you. I think that has changed.
Sticking with WWE on the talent side of things, not to do with firing so much, but something that could be an effect from it. Drew McIntyre is a person that we've heard has not signed a new deal yet. Do you think the pressure's now on for anybody that has a deal coming up, that maybe they have to be a little more take what they're giving me than they did before now, because obviously the company's cutting back and the offer is what the offer is, take it or leave it?
A little bit. Yeah. But I mean, if I'm Drew McIntyre, I'm not scared. Drew McIntyre can go anywhere. With Drew McIntyre, I would say it's a 100% lock that he could get a giant contract with AEW. Could he get as big a one as with WWE? That I don't know. It just depends on what his goals are right now. AEW's a better schedule. You're getting older, and that's a good thing too, to be on the better schedule. He's married. With Drew, I think WWE, I think it's hard to leave WWE because the spotlight is so much bigger, and he's very close to the top. Mm-hmm. If he just got a shot, he could be in, he's just below the upper echelon right now.
Right.
And he can be in the upper echelon, at any time. It's like he could be certainly facing Cody Rhodes or Seth Rollins or Roman Reigns or any of the top guys in a snap of the fingers. So, that's a great position to be in. But, with Drew, the thing is it's like, it's not really an issue until probably, April, because they tacked on all that time for the time that he was out injured. So, his contract was actually up, I think, in December, but they've extended it for several months. So it's not anything of the, there's many, many, many more months before this becomes a real concern.
Okay.
But, at some point, does he play both sides against the other? He should. If I was him, I would play both sides against the other.
Yeah, I guess I'm just curious as to how well it might pay off now as it would have a few months back, but we'll have to see what happens. Speaking of familiar faces that have been gone for a while, there was a Randy Orton sighting at the Performance Center this past week. Any update on that? What he's doing? What was going on? Was he there working out? Was he there coaching? Have you heard anything beyond him showing up?
I mean, he's supposed to be coming back soon, but what that means, I don't know. His back was in very, very bad shape. Bad enough. We know, Bob, his father said, the doctors told him not to come back, but he didn't know that Randy would take that. I think Randy's going to give it a go. He's been out for a long time. So I expect him to give it a go whenever, I don't have a date or anything like that, but I think it's the fact that he's out there working out tells me it's probably, somewhat soon.
And last WWE note here, we kind of alluded to at the beginning with the Fox deal falling through and now SmackDown moving to USA next year. The word is that Raw and NXT are going to be up for grabs. And WWE is touting, well, there's outside and unexpected interests out there. We've talked this to death about the renewals with SmackDown, thinking that Fox might still be in the picture and that the audience might still be there. Do you think Fox would have any interest in taking the Monday night?
No.
Do you think they're done with wrestling now?
I think if Fox wanted to keep wrestling, they would have kept SmackDown. SmackDown was doing good numbers for them. Yeah, I think Fox just felt the price was too high for what they were getting, and they don't need it. And they could, they're not going to find something and put in that time slot and do anywhere near the numbers. But obviously, their decision was it was not worth the money. And Raw is a higher priced thing. Plus, Raw's 3 hours and Fox only has 2 hours of prime time. So no, that's not going to happen. I mean, as far as where Raw goes or what happens with Raw, they've been talked about moving it off of Monday, which I think would be a mistake. But, we have to, there's all kinds of different things. We know FX, we know Amazon Prime. There's probably others, that are in that mix.
Is there a softer night in TV than Mondays that would need the help of a Raw to move there? Like, what's the day that's hurting, I guess, for ratings? Friday.
It doesn't matter.
Day, wasn't it?
Well, I would not want to spend the money that USA spent for SmackDown and then put it on a Friday. I think that's just stupid. They may still do it. TV programmers do stupid things, but it's like you're spending that kind of money for a show on a night of TV where you're not going to draw a big audience with the show. I'm not saying that they'll be number one in cable every single week, but the point is you'll be 20% higher on Thursday than you will be on Friday. So why spend that money to get a 20% lower number? USA may get everything. It may be USA, NBC, Universal gets the whole package with Peacock. I could see it being a pure NBC Universal product, but WWE, I think that they want to look at other options and see what's out there. And maybe if the money is much better with streaming, you go with it. One of the things with the SmackDown is that they're getting more money than they would have got with Fox, but they're getting less exposure. And Endeavor, people are for Ari Emanuel, is they're looking for money. They feel the exposure is the exposure, but they're looking at pure money deals. So yeah, they took more money for less exposure because the key is television rights fees. They're not as worried. They think that's the key revenue stream, and it is, as opposed to house shows, pay-per-views, merchandise, all the stuff that more exposure would help.
Do you think they would dare move Raw to strictly a streaming platform?
If the money is right, I think that they would consider it.
That's the thing. Like, Monday has always been wrestling night forever. And before it was on TV, that's the way it worked even in a lot of territories back in the day.
Since the early 90s, Monday's been the big wrestling night. Yeah. Or one of the big. Since 95, it's been the wrestling night. Yes. Yeah. So that's a 28-year tradition that I wouldn't want to mess with. Yet I think that they look at this competition from football this year and just go, is this really the optimum? It's like, for 9 months, it's great, but what about these 3 months? Maybe we would do better on Tuesday. They did have a year because of football where they went to Tuesday, and that was a long time ago. And that might have been the 80s even when that happened. But I remember the one year that they did move to Tuesdays, and the ratings didn't go down, but it's a different world than the 80s. Wrestling.
Oh, there's so much more of everything. Yeah.
There's so much more. Yeah, there's so much more. And I wouldn't want to move from Monday. I just think it's too much of a traditional night. I wouldn't want to move from USA. But if someone offers more, you kind of have to take it.
Okay, let's go over to AEW here. Thank you again, as always, Dave, for being here. I just want to get an update. Have you heard anything on the status of Jon Moxley? He took that one driver, and there was the big kerfuffle of the 3 count that didn't happen, and then the second one, and finally they got it done.
Yeah, that neither of them hurt him. He was hurt on the cannonball before the match ever started. Okay, and it continued, and then as the match went on, essentially here's what happened. He took the first one, he shook it off, he thought, whatever, and continued and did the match. And as the match was going on, I think he was feeling more and more like something's off. And I think at that point, I feel that it's a lot like what happened with Mercedes and Willow Nightingale, in the sense of, you know what, I may be out. And if I'm out, the best thing for business is to put somebody over, rather than keep the title and then have to do, a tournament or be in limbo or whatever, one of those things that was unforeseen. So he decided, probably about a minute before that finish, or at some point slightly before that finish, that I may be hurt. Because of that, I'm putting him over, and he made the call because he's a big enough star to make the call. I'm putting him over. And so it was supposed to be, he told Phoenix, give me your finish. And Phoenix gave him the finish. And then, I don't know, I guess Rick Knox didn't know. That's the only thing I can come up with. And I think maybe they just felt that, maybe Moxley felt that if I don't kick out, he'll count the 3 and that's fine. But he got panicked because it's a title match. Right. And because the wrong guy.
On TV,
we're on TV. I could see from his perspective why he would do that. So he held up, and then it looked bad.
Well, either way, it's one of those things where a lot of people have had their opinion on it. Obviously, it wasn't a great moment for a first-time wrestling fan to see that and go, huh. But for those of us that have been watching wrestling, we've seen stuff like this happen before. I guess stuff happens in wrestling. The same thing happened with Willow.
It's you just adapt to it. Willow Nightingale got a little bit of a push. Hopefully this helps Phoenix a little bit.
But
and then
the
Moxley,
debate that I've been hearing after all this has nothing to do with whether or not Phoenix should have been put over or not, but it has to do with should Rick Knox have counted to 3? And so far, there's been a resounding yes across the board. I'm wondering what your thoughts are. Yeah.
Yes. The referee's job should be. I mean, I don't know how they're taught in AEW. I know how they're taught in WWE, but I've seen WWE refs do the same thing. Even though you're taught, call it as a shoot, And I think all referees should go with the idea: if the guy fails to kick out, you count 3, and the onus is on him, not you. But if you're a referee, you're scared to death to change the title.
Right.
So, I get it, and obviously nobody told Rick Knox, because if they did, he'd have counted 3, or maybe they did, and he just was like, again, I don't know if Moxley told him, and he was just like, Tony's going to fire me if I screw this up. I don't know what, I mean, the only one who knows is Knox. But my gut says from watching it that he did not know that was the finish, because the second time he counted 3 when he was like, oh boy. So, I think it was just one of those things where
it is what it is,
he should have counted 3 anyway, but it's like it's a title match. So that made it a lot harder.
Too much pressure. Got it. We are almost out of time here, Dave. So thank you again. Just quickly again on Mox, is he okay though? Like, we're expecting him back. He's not out for a while. You haven't heard anything. It's like a concussion.
Well, it was a minor concussion. So a concussion can be a week. A concussion can be a month. A concussion can be 6 months.
But no official word yet. So
it wasn't a bad concussion. But even a mild concussion doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be back in a week or two. So there's no word. When everything is ready and can be cleared, he will be back. And who knows when, that's no one knows the answer to that question.
All right. WrestleDream a week away. The biggest match you're looking forward to is
Danielson and Sabre.
It's got to be the one, right? It's got to be the one.
Yeah. That's a dream match for me. It's like two of the greatest in the world. I don't know how, because like Sabre's not that big of a star in this country. So I don't know, like, as carrying a pay-per-view, it's like, and I'm the rest of the card, whatever. But I mean, to me, that's the big one, but I don't know that that's for the public. That's
what though, they're doing. This is one of those shows they're doing for their hardcores though. And I think that's who it's going to be made for. And I think that's who it's going to appeal to. The last thing I have to ask you, we only got like a minute left here. There's this clip going around, wrestling on a bullet train. The hell?
Oh, there's Suzuki and Shinshiro Takagi.
Yeah. This was a DDT thing, right?
Yeah. They did the DDT, did the match, got all kinds of pub in the United States. It was on NBC, it was on ABC. Right. I mean, literally, I would suspect that more people saw the clip of this match than saw any wrestling match probably this year, because it was on it's on network news.
Yeah.
And it was on local news in big markets. Those shows have big audiences.
That's just it. You always hope to get noticed somehow in this business. And Dave, you've done a great job of showcasing everything here. Check out the latest edition, of course, the Wrestling Observer newsletter, and always tap in with Dave and the rest of the crew over there at Figure 4 and WrestlingObserver.com. Dave, as always, a pleasure, my friend. We'll talk to you next week.
Okay, great. Have a great week.
McGuire on Wrestling.
It's a pleasure to catch up with this guy. Our once-a-year conversation, I suppose, with Al Castle from PWI. How are you?
I'm good, Mike. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
Tremendous. Thanks for coming back. We did this last year when the list came out, and I thought, hey, new list. Should see what Al's up to. And things are still the same? Any different since we last spoke a year ago? Anything happened?
It's always the busiest week for us at PWI. I mean, I guess in some ways the work is done once the magazine is out, but now it's dealing with all the hate and honestly it hasn't been that bad this year. That's always a good thing when I think the good feedback outweighs the bad, and I think by and large it's been pretty well received.
What would you say has been the one thing that people are maybe the nicest about? Let's start with the nice stuff first and say, what do you think is something everybody's kind of in agreement with this year?
Well, I think it's been cool to see people's reaction to our number one, Seth Rollins. I think people know by now. And what's interesting is that I think the reaction that a lot of people are having reading the list and finding out for the first time is very similar to what we had at PWI putting it together. It was sort of a revelation for us that he was number one too, in as much as we all got together, and I think everybody came to the meeting with maybe some people in their mind, some names in their mind who would be number one. And I think it's fair to say that nobody in our committee, which was about 8 people, would have expected that we would arrive at Seth Rollins. And then we hashed it out over quite a while. It was, I think, the hardest time we've ever had of getting a consensus for number one. Mm-hmm. But when we did, I think everybody felt good about it. And it was sort of like looking around like, yeah, that feels about right. And I think that's the same reaction I've seen from people learning about him being number one.
Now, before we go in the other direction here, I do want to just say that we did talk about this a year ago when we did this, but the PWI 500 every year comes out. There's always interest. There's always a little bit of controversy around it and everything else. But one of the questions that always gets asked every year is, what is the window of time you're looking at to evaluate these wrestlers from? Because I think some people think that it's done almost to the date of press, and it's nowhere near that, right?
No, it's not. So this year it was actually extended a month because there are some changes in our publication schedule. It is July 1st of last year, 2022, through July 31st of this year. So it's a 13-month window this year. So a little more current, actually, than it's been in the past. Sometimes that lead time hurts us, because I always think back to the year that we chose The Miz as number one. And when we chose him, he was kind of riding high as the world champ, and by the time the issue came out, suffice to say, he was way down in the cards, and it wasn't looking so good anymore. I think in this case, it actually helped us a little bit, because Seth has been on even more of a roll since we put out the issue, and it's kind of another month or so to settle into that role as the workhorse defending world champion. So in this case, I think it's aged pretty well.
And that's just it. I mean, the biggest story, I guess, of this is that, again, all 3 members of the Shield are in the top 3, of course. And it all kind of makes sense, really, when you look at it. I thought it was, pretty ballsy to actually have Roman Reigns as number 2, considering the investment that WWE has put in him. But again, when you look at it from the working standpoint and just the availability and being around, Rollins makes perfect sense there. Gunther coming in hot at number 4. Was that an easy choice, you think?
Yeah, and in fact, there were people on the committee who, some of them were pushing for him to be number 1, and it was a real discussion. And me going into, the 2 people you just named, Roman and Gunther, very much in the mix for number 1. I think I could say comfortably for myself, and there's some other people in the committee, that's who I thought would be number 1 going in to the meeting. I don't know that I took it as a given, but obviously the biggest star in the business, and a year that he made history in so many different ways. I understood the marks against him with the inactivity, and I think ultimately that's what cost him. Gunther, there's definitely a case for him, and there was that conversation of, I look back to the year before my time where we had Dean Malenko as number 1, and it was kind of a surprise and also sort of an acknowledgement that there wasn't that heavyweight dominant, main event star. So you reward somebody else for really excelling. And I think there could have been a similar case here for Gunther, who very much the heavyweight, but an intercontinental champion, and not something that usually shows up that well on this list, but another guy making history, and we actually picked him before he officially hit the mark of longest intercontinental champion. So both those guys very much in the mix. That the Shield is 1, 2, 3. That's another, I don't know, criticism, but certainly one of the questions, accusations we've gotten is that it was intentional, that it was a gimmick, that we set it out. And it truly was not. And in fact, it was at the tail end of the meeting. And I think it was by PWI podcast co-host Brian Solomon, who was the first to kind of notice it when we were kind of wrapping things up. And it was like, hey, did anybody notice that, the Shield is 1, 2, 3? That it was a nice that it turned out that way. Seth, on the day that we announced it, tweeted out a photo of the 3 Shield fists together, which was cool. And I do think, again, not intentional at all, but it really speaks to how far the 3 guys have come and how really they are 3 dominant forces in the wrestling industry.
Well, and they're guys that the companies have on both sides have been able to kind of rest on a bit, and have some security with those three because they know they're always going to deliver. So, I mean, there are people that are fans of all three for different reasons. There are detractors of all three for different reasons. But I think when it comes down to it, as far as nuts and bolts, who you can count on, those three are pretty solid talents for their respective companies and even their respective shows. So,
yeah, that's why I was in Arthur Ashe Stadium last night for Grand Slam. And that's why it was so scary what happened with Moxley last night. I took some video after because I haven't seen the TV version of it, but I imagine they cut away at some point. But it was definitely a scary moment there where Mox seemed to be, I don't know if knocked out is the word, but clearly that finish didn't go as planned. It'd be tragic, horrible for anybody, but Mox is so important to AEW, and that was kind of the point we made with putting him at number 3. Ahead of an MJF, who was the dominant world champion for the year, but Mox really the heart and soul of AEW, and especially around this time last year where things were such a mess in AEW with Brawl Out and everything that was going on. Mm-hmm. They lose their world champion, and Moxley's he's been the go-to. He's been old, reliable, and he's I think been the MVP of AEW for a while, and putting aside just as a human being, you want to make sure he's healthy, doing well, but it would be huge if they didn't have Jon Moxley around.
Since you brought up Brawl Out, I'm just going to get out of the way now. Punk not on this list at all.
No, and I think more than anything, it's an activity issue. I don't believe he would have made. I'm sure he didn't make the activity standard, which the threshold, which I believe is 10 matches or 6 matches in 6 different months. And, again, this wrapping up July 31st, he only came back, what was it, May, June, something like that with Collision. Yeah. So. I know he had a few matches, but, if he wrestled more, he would have been eligible because he has not formally announced his retirement or anything like that. It was just a matter of activity.
Have to do the math, see if he makes it on the next year's list if he doesn't come back, and if he does, maybe he's top 10. We'll find out what happens, I guess.
It would take a lot, I'm guessing that's not happening in AEW.
No, definitely not there. I could pick apart the top 10 with you as much as we can here, but I mean, really, not much to complain about. Some people were surprised to see Vikingo over MJF.
Mm-hmm. Is that just again activity? More than anything, and in fact, I think. MJF had even fewer title defenses than Roman did. Now, granted, he had it for a shorter time than Roman, only getting the world title in November. But really, if you pull up a Cage Match is the go-to site where they tally up match results and all that. Mm-hmm. And here's one where I think he would have benefited from the evaluation period extending a little further because he's been busy the last several weeks and last couple months, and I think that could have been a big difference maker. But it ending when it did, there just wasn't a ton there. I'm a big MJF fan. I'm a Long Island guy, so we're the one part in the world that was cheering for MJF before I guess he officially turned babyface. So a huge fan. I think he's a super talent. Again, it was an issue of activity.
The only one I'll really other pick apart, I'm happy to see Josh Alexander make the top 10 here, but I guess the biggest question mark for a lot of fans on this was Cody Rhodes coming in at number 10. Was that just an activity thing, or?
No, well, partially, yeah. He missed the first half, basically, of the evaluation period. But this is where the criteria is really important. And the one thing, we always talk about is this is not a popularity contest. This is not who is the most over, who's selling the most merch. By those measures, clearly, like Cody would be in the mix for number 1. But you're talking about a guy, and again, I feel like I got to preface all this stuff. Huge Cody fan. I love Cody Rhodes. And everybody at the magazine does. I know. I think his sister tweeted something out, sort of like, conspiracy theory that we don't like him or something like that. And I guess I can't speak for everybody else, but I love Cody Rhodes. I think he's the best thing, or certainly one of the best things going for WWE right now. But you're talking about a guy who, again, missed the first half of the evaluation period, didn't wear any championships, lost at WrestleMania, lost another key match against Brock Lesnar. So I think 10 is pretty generous. Now, granted, the him being a big star and influence, all that, it is factored in, and then maybe that's how he breaks into the top 10, because we're not blind to the fact that he's super important to WWE and to the wrestling business as a whole, but we also we take into account stuff like wins and losses and activity, and that worked against him.
Well, that answers the top 10 part. Now we'll go into a little bit of the slag, and I personally don't care. I'm not on the list, so what do I care? You know what I mean?
Next year, there's still next year, maybe.
Well, yeah. I'll get 10 matches in. Maybe, probably not.
Yeah.
Does playing on a video game console count? Because in that case, I might have a shot. But one of the question marks, and this one actually came from Dave Meltzer here on the show, was talking about Naito not being on the list.
We missed it. Yeah, I mean, no, we're not going to try to justify it, anything else. It was a mistake. He was on the list at some point. You're talking, and this is no excuses, but you're talking 500 slots. That doesn't mean that we're just dealing with 500 names, because obviously there's so many people who don't make the cut. And so there's all kinds of moving names around, and a guy will be on a list and he'll be taken off the list and put aside to the moment and put back on the list. And every once in a while, something like this happens. We feel terrible about it. I know our editor, Kevin McElvaney, the day that the list came out and he realized it, joked about, booking the first flight to Tokyo to apologize in person. Clearly, Naito should have been on this list. And it was just, we missed it. We apologize to him. And if we could make it right, we would.
Well, it happens. It's out. It's done. And then I guess the other surprise for a lot of fans of his in particular, I don't know if he even cares that much, but Will Ospreay coming in at number 17. Some people kind of raised eyebrows at that one a bit, just based on the criteria. But
it sure, and this is where it really does become subjective. Last year, it was a similar kind of debate with Mox, who just missed the top 10. I think we had him 12 last year, something like that. And this is like where reasonable people could disagree. When you're talking 500 names, slotting a guy at 17 isn't like we're burying him, right? I mean, we're saying he is one of the 20 best wrestlers. And again, even that wording makes me a little uncomfortable, because it's when you say something like best wrestlers, it suggests that 64 is better than 65, and it's not that. It's really an evaluation of the year that you had. Again, reasonable people would disagree. I'm not going to make the case why Ospreay doesn't belong in the top 10. Certainly, you can make the case that he does. You get into questions of who do you remove, right? Yeah. So we just had the Cody conversation. So that would be, if we squeeze somebody else into the top 10, that means that Cody is bumped at least to 11. So I mean, what I'd say is I think we've got a good, solid top 10. I think everybody who is in the top 10 earned their way into the top 10. Can you make an argument for Will Ospreay, who another phenomenal, generational, incredible talent, belongs in the top 10? Sure, you could make that argument. We're not going to, bicker with anybody who thinks otherwise.
It becomes splitting hairs at some point here.
Yeah.
One thing you and I did talk about last year was an influx of Canadian talent, and I was happy to see again this year a ton of great Canadians being represented, especially on the indie level. Some people I work with directly, in some cases, names like Zoe Sager out of Edmonton, and also wrestles with us with the Hearts and Dungeon Wrestling in Calgary. Jody Threat, who is making a big name for herself as well. Guys like Mitch Clark and people like that who are in this list as well. I guess the biggest question I always ask every year is how much of your concentration is on the indies and looking for new stars to get into those lower rungs and see how they go up.
It's one of the biggest challenges, because obviously with 500 names, the majority of them do not work for WWE or AEW or New Japan. The majority are independent workers. And again, I talk about there only being 500 slots. When you think about the population of independent wrestlers just in the U.S., right? I mean, never mind Canada, Japan, UK, Mexico. I'm sure you get into the tens of thousands, if not more. And as hard as we work at it, and we really do try to be diligent in, getting our tentacles all over the country and all over the world to be mindful of what's happening. It's impossible, right? To know, and inevitably, we put this list together and we hear from somebody from a certain region in the U.S. or somewhere else saying, why was so and so from my local, independent territory, not in there? He's incredible. He's making waves. He's like the best thing going.
How dare you ignore my favorite?
and they might not be wrong. That's just it. I mean, like. And what comes to mind, me being on Long Island for years, like they'd look to me as like, what's the indie scene on Long Island? And I'm not even saying I'm not up to speed to it, but I remember, you talk to other people, and there was a mom of a kid who went to the same school as my kid, who trained to be a pro wrestler. She was training out of Creative Pro. Out here, she's back there now, and I remember like texting her, any names that we should know about. This is 5-6 years ago, and the indie scene, and she says, "Yeah, there's this guy Maxwell Jacob Friedman," and it was the first I had ever heard the name, and wow. So, but like even then there was like eyes on this guy, and I think those kind of people exist all over the place, right? Everybody has got that guy or that girl. Or maybe several of them in their local independent that are really, they look like there's something special. They're onto something. And again, you could absolutely make the case for why they belong on this list. It certainly gets harder when you get outside of, geographic US, even into Canada. I think we've always had a closer eye on Canada than some places, in part because a lot of our riders are concentrated in the Northeast, and for a long time we had Dan Murphy, who is in Western New York, and I think kept tabs pretty well on the scene up there. It fluctuates, it's like sometimes it is like where are your riders? What we encourage absolutely workers to do, but fans by all means as well, is reach out to us, put if you don't think they're on our radar, please put them on our radar.
Well, like I said, man, if you ever want to add a ninth panel, I'm your guy here. But yeah, as far as maybe Western or Central Canada goes, but for the most part, honestly, I think the biggest thing to remember with the PWI 500 is that this is meant to be fun. I mean, at the end of it all, I mean, for me, getting the PWI 500 every year as a kid meant getting to go through and just see all the pictures of different wrestling, period. Yeah. And so now it's a case of, well, not only can you see the pictures, but then you can...
I made a point, I didn't want to cuss on these things moving forward, but how freaking cool was that? Like Dan Lavransky coming back, and seriously, it's like a time capsule going back to any of these wrestlers' albums. And by the way, if you've never heard the Beauregard album, highly recommend. But that's the perfect place to close the book today.
I totally agree.
Thank you very much for listening to McGuire on Wrestling. If you could do me a solid, give the show a 5-star rating wherever you download your podcast. Give it a thumbs up, whatever you got to do. Don't forget, we're on YouTube now, so you can catch the shows that way. If maybe downloading to your pod is a little harder to do, or if you're at the office, you want to listen there, whatever you want to do. We're making the show as accessible as possible and always for free for you. So that's happening. And don't forget to get your questions in. Ask Meltzer anything. Next week we're recording. It'll air the week after. It's going to be a ton of fun there. So again, send those to me at McGuire Show or McGuire Show at yahoo.com. Until next week, as always, thank you for listening and letting me do what I do. Play safe, drive safe. I'll be seeing ya. I copy-pasted it. It's Dan. How could I not?
As objectively and scientifically as we can. But, absolutely. Even the same team, the same group that put this together, you get us in a room today, we might have a different list. So it's 500, right? I mean, how scientific can you be about it? But it's a lot of fun. Again, the biggest thing we do each year, and the same way, this is just selfishly on my part, but the same way you talk about how it's fun going through the list and kind of being introduced to new names. That's one of the real fun things about putting together the list is, especially when you get deep into it, is you got to do some research on these people. And so, and in some ways it's easier to do than before because you jump on YouTube, you look at their matches, and you can get turned on to some really cool wrestlers that you've never heard of before. It's just up until yesterday, working on the women's list that's next up, the women's 250 this year. And I'll be honest that I don't follow women's wrestling, certainly outside of the big companies, as closely as I do men's. So in some ways, working on that list is a lot harder for me. But again, it's also in some ways more rewarding because I get to see all this incredible talent that I might not be aware of.
It takes you back to those days, again, of discovering new faces for the first time. So I get that 100%. Al, you've been great with your time again. I know you're in the middle of 100 things going on here. The last thing we'll talk on really quickly, though, we're having this discussion the day that so far at least 9 releases from WWE coming through. 2 of them on the list. On number 108, Mustafa Ali, and number 393, Dolph Ziggler. Any thoughts on those 2 guys now and what the future might hold for them?
Yeah, I mean, with Ali, in as much as, for a long time, there was word of him wanting out, right? Maybe this ends up as a
flat out, yeah.
Yeah, maybe this ends up a blessing in disguise for him. I mean, I think he has to be realistic about what his career trajectory was in WWE. I could totally believe that he'll be busier, have more fun, maybe not make more money. That's something else. Outside of WWE than in WWE, but I think a lot of we've seen this so many times. A guy leaves WWE, kind of rediscovers his love of pro wrestling, because of that, gets better, and then becomes a hotter commodity that WWE then wants back. There's a guy by the name of Cody Rhodes that comes to mind who kind of fits that bill. Ziggler, I think,
barely cracked the top 10.
Ziggler, I was the most disappointed to see his name, not because I'm expecting him to have another big run or anything like that, but that's where you do, and maybe some of this is naive because I get it's a business, but you do wonder about, or at least loyalty comes to mind, right? I mean, this guy has been part of your company for what, 20 years, close to,
pretty close,
and is just sort of up for whatever, right? I mean, that's always been my sense of the guy, and clearly he I think in some ways he's overachieved in WWE, in as much as he's been a world champion. He's headlined SummerSlam. He's done it all. But to me, he always seemed like the ultimate company guy. And I'm just surprised that they couldn't find something for the guy to do. It's a real shame. And because he's getting up there, it's tough because I don't know if I know his brothers worked in AEW. I don't know if that helps you kind of grease the skids over there. But regardless, I just feel like in situation like that, I wish there was something to be said for loyalty and just taking care of a guy who's been the ultimate team player for 20 years.
Well, there you have it. Again, Al Castle from Pro Wrestling Illustrated, PWI 500 list is out now. Are the hard copies out? Can we get the physical copy?
I got mine in the mail yesterday. So if you're, another reason to subscribe, it'll come right to your mailbox. And now we've got bundles where you could get both the digital edition. If you had the digital edition, you would have been reading it last week, and then you'd have it in your mailbox a week later, so you could flip through it. I haven't seen it yet on the newsstands. I think that usually takes a little longer, but I expect that we will. But don't stress out going to find it at your Barnes and Nobles. If you still have Barnes and Nobles, go to pwi-online.com, subscribe, download it, make sure it arrives at your mailbox, and you can be reading it on your phone today if you want it.
Al, always a pleasure. We'll talk to you again next year.
All right. Have a good one, man.
McGuire on Wrestling.
Well, big thanks to you for being here once again this week. Big ups to Al Castle from Pro Wrestling Illustrated, as well as Dave Meltzer for joining us every week as he does. More guests on tap. I've been kind of saving things for a while here, and summer's been busy. I'll tell you right now, there's always a time in radio when it's the busiest, and it's September. Every year, everybody's got everything to do, and they do it all in September because in Canada here, that's, just before fall or autumn for some of you, where the seasons change and everybody just hermits indoors for the next 7 months. That's what we do. Anyway, thank you for being here. If you'd like to support the show, McGuireShow.com. Join us on Facebook. Get in the conversation. Just look up Team MOW, McGuire on Wrestling. It's all there. And hopefully you can join me here next week. More fun to come. And as always, thank you for listening and letting me do what I do. Till then, play safe, drive safe. Seeing ya.